Hi everyone, welcome to this short video on secularisation, the arguments against. I'm going to try and take you through some of the key ideas of the arguments against secularisation and try to make some of the links that exist between this topic, the previous arguments for secularisation, and the topic previous to that on organisations and how you can draw comparisons between the rise of certain organisations and oppose that perhaps to the decline of more traditional forms of religion. So if we start with what we already know and what we've covered so far on the course, we've seen arguments such as cultural transition, which would support the idea of religion being an important feature in people's lives still. We see from Bruce, he argues that those who come into a new environment are offered support through religion, and it gives them a sense of comfort in adapting to their new environment. We've also looked at cultural defence, where actually in the face of persecution and racism, that religion can be a way to defend against that and can unite a community in face of that hostility, such as certain migrants may experience in the UK. We've also looked at the Marxist perspective of religion, and I think this is a good opportunity to recap that and to argue that actually for certain groups in society, religion is still important. Now, we could talk about age as a factor on top of that as well and argue that the older generation are more likely to be religious. We've just seen how ethnic minorities are more likely to be religious. Women as well, perhaps if we use the arguments from Miller and Hoffman, for example, about how women are socialised into religion. But specifically here, I think Marxism is a good one because we can go back to looking at Troeltsch's features of sects, about how they're highly committed, how they attract the poor and oppressed. Again, there's a nice link there to Weber's exclamations of marginality and the theodicy of disprivilege. So we can see actually for the poor, they may be attracted to sects, and so therefore again we can't generalise those arguments about secularisation, because for some groups secularisation isn't an issue, and actually religion is still an important factor in their life. And finally, we can go back to looking specifically at the rise of New Age movements. I think this is a really important aspect to look at this point, because this encapsulates really the whole argument against secularisation about the rise of a form of religion which is based on the decline of tradition, the rise of individualism, and the sense of seeking self-spirituality from within. Now, we've seen Heelis's argument that around 2,000 people practice this in the UK, so there is a significant minority, you could argue, that practice New Age. Drain argues that this is because of a loss in traditional religions and in science, and that decline of meta-narratives, as postmodernists would argue, has led to the rise of this more individualised form of religion, which emphasises the self and seeking answers and truth for yourself. Bruce would also argue that rise of New Age is due to them being less demanding. So if we take a step back and think back to Troeltsch's argument of churches being highly committed, in the same vein that sects are, we can see again that this may be an alternative to that, because it allows people to almost dip in and out when they wish, and allows for that sense of picking and mixing between beliefs that you subscribe to and those you don't, which the church would not allow, as they hold that monopoly of truth, as Troeltsch would argue. So that's the context of where we're coming from here, on top of the secularisation arguments. So to explore some of the more substantial points against secularisation, we can turn to postmodernism and Daly's argument of believing about belonging. That essentially, when we look at church attendance, we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. That people practice more so now in private just because they don't attend those organisations on a Sunday, for example, doesn't mean that they're any less religious. It just means that they're doing so in a more private environment. Davey argues that when people want a more public expression of faith, such as during funerals, during baptisms, during weddings, then there's still a small minority of clergy who practice religion on our behalf. So there's still this group that are highly devoted, highly committed, and highly knowledgeable in traditional religion, and they are the priests, the rest of the clergy. And they practice on our behalf for the wider community, so that when we want to seek an answer and seek a sense of comfort, we turn to that smaller minority. But in the meantime, we still practice at home, in private, in a more less traditional vein, really. And so she argues that we believe about belonging, that we still feel commitment to religion, just we don't attend. And so to use attendance as a measure of secularisation is misguided. Terrible pronunciation coming here, but Harvey Leger argues that we experience something called cultural amnesia. So in other words, because we lack religious socialisation, as we've seen when we considered age as a factor in religious belief, the church no longer has the authority to impose its views upon us. We are much more inclined now to go out and seek beliefs for ourselves. We're not taught at an early age what to believe. We're not taught at an early age to adhere to scripture. Instead, young people are finding religion themselves, and there's a market for it. You can go out and find elements of New Age, or Buddhism, or Christianity even, that you do subscribe to, and bits that you don't. So you form an identity and a sense of self from this pick and mix. So again, it's not that religion is in decline, but it's that it's changing. It's the changing nature of religion that we should consider here. Religion hasn't declined as a whole. People are just using it in a very individualistic and different manner today. For Harvey Leger, this creates two types of groups of religious believers today. Firstly, you have the pilgrims, which is what we're focused on really, is this group of New Age subscribers who are seeking something more individualistic, seeking something through self-discovery and that sense of self-spirituality from within. Now those groups are the ones who are going to benefit highly from this pick and mix culture and from the exposure and boom of New Age spirituality. The other type are converts. They're more seeking traditional religion, and so they might be the ones who use Bruce's idea of cultural transition, those ethnic minorities who are adapting to a new environment and so seek religion as a source of comfort and as a way of doing so. So therefore religion might lose its collective identity, but it's still an important role in certain groups' lives. However, we should note that if we look at census data from 2011, that most people that identify as being Christian actually are identifying as being white British according to Day's research. Bruce would argue that if you don't attend, then actually you lack commitment, and so religion isn't an important factor in your life because you're not willing to make the effort to demonstrate that collective worship. And finally, recently, the BSA has found that over half the people in this country no longer hold religious belief. And so that has to throw into question, really, to what extent are this believing without belonging group a significant part of religious belief today? It doesn't add up, does it? If we look at those figures from the BSA, that those who practice in private, as according to Davey, who hold this still strong religious belief, that doesn't quite match to what we're seeing here with those who now commonly identify as having no belief at all. So perhaps secularisation is more prevalent than the likes of Davey give credit for. Continuing this theme of opportunities and options open to individuals today, we see this argument particularly provided by Ruth of the extended spiritual marketplace. Now, Ruth argues that there is a wide range of ideas for young people to pick and mix from and to form their identity from. Now, to make the link to the previous topics we've considered, we could argue and look at Heelis's research here that this particularly favours that uptake of audience cults and New Age movements who are able to appeal to a younger market through the likes of social media, through the likes of offering a much less committed sense of religion. That's going to appeal within this marketplace for young people to be attracted to. Lynch suggests that this allows young people to form new identities for themselves outside of traditional religion. So as that sense of socialization, as that power of religious socialization from traditional religion declines, the uptake of religious belief is now through this marketplace, and particularly through the likes of New Age movements. Cushak particularly focuses on this element of the lack of religious socialization. If you don't subscribe at an early age to church teachings on sacred texts, for example, in the Bible, then as an adult and as a younger person later on, there's much more option out there for you. Cushak would argue that you're more open-minded, that you're more willing to explore these options. And so that's what gives you the sense of freedom and choice to establish a new sense of identity. So again, all of this is characterized by greater freedom, greater individuality within modern and postmodern society. And so we see people now still committed to religious belief, but they're doing so in a much more, perhaps casual, but much more available sense, with options available to them, rather than being dictated to in a traditional manner. However, does this balance, so does the loss of traditional religious believers become counterweighted with those who are taking up new forms of religious belief through these organisations? Well, no, it doesn't. There is no equality between those two things. Heelis found that Heelis's Woodhead study in Kendal found within this holistic milieu, as they observe, this marketplace almost, this environment of spirituality and new religious organisations and New Age movements, that in 2000, 7.9% of people were attending church. At the same time, only 1.6% of people are taking part in these New Age movements. Now, they would argue that there is an increase and an increased rate in which these groups are uptaking these forms of religion, but there is certainly not an equality between the rate of loss of traditional religion and the rate of increased New Age movement. Bruce would also argue that there is a lack of commitment amongst these groups, that most people are casual believers in this. They're willing to dabble in things like meditation and yoga and crystals and tarot readings, etc., but they're not willing to make these a significant part of their lives. Also, these beliefs aren't being socialized from one generation to the next. They're not being shared within couples even. We can see that within relationships between men and women, where the woman was taking part in New Age movements, that 3/4 of husbands and partners didn't share those kinds of beliefs. Now, if there isn't a commitment between those two parents, it's likely that those beliefs are not going to be passed down to the next generation. And that's what we see with 32% of children only sharing those beliefs when a parent holds that belief in New Age. So that means we have 68% of children not taking on that belief and not carrying that themselves. This throws into doubt, really, the extent to which these new religious movements can replace old traditional religious forms.